Oh boy, yeah. Anyways, welcome back, true believers and all you spectacular Spidey fans, to another very exciting Spider-Man PS4 related video. And as you saw from those very intriguing looking pictures within the intro, we are once again going to dive into some very interesting behind the scenes look of Spider-Man PS4's development. Now, if you did happen to notice previously, the most recent behind the scenes look that we did receive of Spider-Man PS4 is actually all the way back in March during GDC. And during that time, we received some very interesting gameplay footage of Spider-Man PS4 in action within the alpha stages of its development cycle. Although this time around, instead of receiving some actual footage of the game being played, we did receive a full thread of photos of seeing what the game looked like during the very early alpha stages of development, specifically relating to the game's UI system and the HUD. And huge shout out to Andrew over on Twitter for being the first one to post this link relating to the major thread of photos relating to Spider-Man PS4's HUD and UI systems. So make sure to go follow Andrew on Twitter and support him as much as you can. But relating to the archive itself, this thread was actually posted by one of Insomniac Games' many UI designers who did have a blast working on Spider-Man PS4. And even though I will leave a link in the description below to the full archive itself, it's very interesting because it doesn't really specify who it particularly comes from. But regardless, if you do manage to access that link in the description, the first thing that you will see be posted on the page is Spider-Man PS4, Be Greater. When Sony reached Insomniac Games to propose a new project for a Marvel IP, it was clear that all the Insomniacs would be thrilled to take on the most difficult task doing justice to one of the best and most mistreated heroes in the history of video games, Spider-Man. This project is the biggest, most ambitious by Insomniac to date. Existing technology would be enhanced and perfected, and new tech would be created to deliver on everyone's highest expectations. I had the chance to be in the forefront of design and development of this tech on the UI and HUD for the game. Finally being able to implement a completely 3D HUD handled by the engine reacting to the physics of the game in real time. During 3 years, I helped devise, direct, and implement the vision and art direction of the game from the graphic and UI design perspective, allowing it to evolve as the game evolved itself with new takes on design and visuals. On top of menus, HUD, and items like POIs, waypoints, and UI systems to guide the player, I also had the chance to design a few in-world assets like vehicles, badges, and logos in collaboration with the character artists and environment artists. So again, even though I'm not 100% sure who this archive was posted by at Insomniac, I do think an expert relating to the UI and HUD systems involved in the game's development is none other than Gil Doran over at Insomniac Games. Not only is Gil the user interface and user experience lead at Insomniac Games who worked on Spider-Man PS4, but he also has his own unique Easter egg within one of the City That Never Sleeps DLC bases in the game itself. And given how much the game's UI and HUD systems thoroughly evolved throughout the main course of development, huge props to Gil for actually managing such a hard task. But still, I thought it'd be interesting if we thoroughly broke down and analyzed all of the game's early stages of development relating to the UI and HUD systems and see how they slowly evolved and changed over time. And to begin, let's start off with this awesome picture which showcases Spider-Man fighting an inner demon, which looks like to be during the Charles Standish Oscorp CFO mission during the second half of the game. Now, before we fully start diving into the UI and HUD systems itself, I do want to point out that the entirety of these images showcases the earlier advanced suit design all the way back from E3 2016. And even though I much prefer the finalized version of the advanced suit that we have in the main game, I just love seeing the earlier concept design of the advanced suit within all these images. But moving on from the suit itself, the main thing that I can get from this initial image of looking at the earlier versions of the UI and the HUD overall is that the majority of it feels a bit cluttered when looking at the main screen. As you can see here from this image alone, we have the health bar, gadget bar, experience bar, minimap, combat bar, main objectives, side objectives, caller ID, and subtitles all on one screen. Now granted, after the conversation between Peter and MJ ends, I'm sure that the caller ID as well as the side objectives might disappear on screen, but still, I do think the overall UI is pretty big to fit on the overall gameplay. The HUD and UI systems that we have in the final game are just as dynamic as they are within this photo because they do react whenever you move the camera around when swinging or fighting bad guys in the city. And instead of making the UI extremely large and in charge within these earlier concepts, the final game instead does focus on it in certain parts, but rather focuses all the main action on Spider-Man himself. So while this UI does seem very vibrant and colorful on an initial glance, it is very distracting when you are trying to mainly focus as playing Spider-Man fighting or swinging around the city to immerse yourself in the game even more. Plus, if any of these designs may look slightly familiar to you, is because it does look like an extension of what we received within the 2017 HUD during that year's E3 demo. And if you recall from one of the many interviews over at Insomniac Games that related to Spider-Man PS4, specifically with the game's art director of Jacinda Chu, she did state that the game's UI and HUD systems were always thoroughly changing throughout the game's main development. Not only that, but primarily relating to the game's UI design within 2017, Jacinda did state that the majority of the color palette that was going on with that design was kind of a contrast between the more realistic tone of Marvel's New York. So alongside the game having a bunch of artistic and graphical updates made throughout the entirety of its development, the overall UI system was made so that way they could blend the earlier designs that they had in mind, as well as making a more modernized and simplistic design that could fit Spider-Man as well. And even though I do thoroughly appreciate some of these design choices that you will see in the other pictures throughout the video, I still think that the overall product that we do have in the final game is really well thought out and very well laid out for a UI designer as well as an art director for the majority of the game's visual aesthetic. Whenever the main HUD is on screen in the final game, it does serve its purpose relating to keeping track of Spider-Man's health, gadgets, and experience, as well as all the other minute details when fighting bad guys in the city. But when you are traversing throughout the city just for fun, it is nice to have a little less HUD on the screen so that way you can feel more immersed within this game's overall world. And in my personal opinion, given all the light colorings that are throughout the UI and HUD systems in the earlier version with the reds and blues, it makes it seem a little bit like a mobile game instead of a fully AAA console Spider-Man game. But what's more easily identifiable in this next image is actually what you see on the edge of the screen itself. If you do happen to look at the edges of some of these photos, specifically with all of the corners in them, you will find a very odd tech aesthetic that was implemented within the entirety of the gameplay overall. So even though I don't like this specific look, I do love that this is a major indication from the UI and HUD designers that they are trying to make the player feel even more like Spider-Man. And the reason why I say that is because all of these design choices are a huge indication that they are trying to make the screen look exactly like the inside of Spider-Man's mask that we see at the very beginning of the game's story. And while this might look cool visually, I do think that this is a big barrier between the gameplay and the immersion that the player has playing as Spider-Man himself. Now, if there was a first-person mode in Spider-Man PS4, I definitely think that they should keep this type of aesthetic when trying to swing around the city in a VR mode. But instead, we do have a third-person perspective while playing as Spider-Man in a very realistic-looking interpretation of Marvel's New York, so I do think that the overall design that they went with in the final game is better than what we see here. And speaking of immersion, it does look like that the overall designers who worked on the game's UI actually doubled down on the size of some of these UI pop-ups that are located throughout the game, which in my opinion takes the whole immersion aspect out of it. As we see in these previous photos, it does look like that the caller ID, even though it is much more detailed with a full model render of the character that Spider-Man is talking to, like this New York citizen or Mary Jane, I do think that it is extremely large to have on the screen when playing the game. This was obviously shown back all the way in E3 2017, where we do see Spider-Man talking to Yuri Watanabe over the phone when he's chasing the helicopter throughout New York. And of course, as we see in the final game, the caller ID is only a small tab that is put above the minimap when you are swinging throughout the city, so I am glad that they actually did put that instead of a much larger picture in the overall game. Not to mention that the tabs that showcase the objectives that you're supposed to do in the game, such as activate this radio tower or actually just try and locate a specific enzyme, are once again very big that I don't think should be that size when playing around the city. And if you do happen to look at the final product, it's obvious to tell that Insomniac minimalized this to make you feel even more connected when playing as Spider-Man in the majority of the game. So even though knowing what you're actually supposed to be doing in the game itself is a very important aspect of the UI, specifically what we see here with these objectives of stopping a crime, fighting Rhino in Times Square, and actually collect up to 50 pigeons, I do think what's more important than any of that is actually having the player feel connected to the character that they are playing as instead of the UI surrounding it. Now, even though this particular UI and HUD design aren't complete immersion breakers, I do appreciate the more simplistic and minimalistic design that they went with in the final game. And to expand on those side objectives a bit more within those earlier HUD designs, it was confirmed in a previous interview with Brian Intihar, who is obviously the creative director of Spider-Man PS4 over at Insomniac Games, that they did plan out individual boss fights with Spider-Man's own respective villains, but instead made them dual boss fights to actually make the story feel more concise. So instead of fighting the Sinister Six individually, we did get what I actually like even more, is boss fights with them teaming up against Spider-Man with Vulture and Electro versus Spidey, and of course Rhino versus Scorpion versus Spidey as well. So if that team-up boss fight between Rhino and Scorpion didn't happen within Spider-Man PS4's main story, it's safe to say that we would have most likely fought Rhino within Times Square. And even though that would have been cool to see be played out, I'm pretty thankful that it didn't happen, because if it did, we would have also had to collect a total of 50 pigeons in this New York. Now, if you don't recall, the main number of pigeons that we ended up collecting in the game was a total of 12, so if it ended up actually being a total of 50, that would have just been flat out insane. And speaking of insane, it's crazy to see that Insomniac actually doubled down on the motion blur mechanic when you web swing throughout the city. Now, obviously, if you played the game yourself, if you do enter a dive bomb or swing a bit faster than the average speed, you will see a bit of motion blur on the side of the screen, making it feel like you're going even faster. And while I do think Insomniac handled the motion blur perfectly in the final game, I do think that is a bit too much emphasis on that impact during the game within the earlier versions in that game's HUD and UI systems. Although, one of my favorite aspects about the game's open world design that we see in these earlier images is actually the very bottom of the earlier version of the minimap. So as you can see here, we do have a much more streamlined version of the maps design from the E3 2017 demo and what we got in the final game within this design. And even though I think I like the final design more because that way we can actually see where the buildings are specifically, I absolutely love what's shown at the very bottom of it. So as we see left to right on the bottom of the minimap, it does showcase how fast Spider-Man is going in miles per hour with his swing speed, as well as how far he is from his objective and how long it'll take for him to get there. The reason why I love this so much is because we've never actually seen how fast Spider-Man is going when he is swinging throughout the city, so actually having a tracker that shows how fast he is going in real time would be really cool to see in the potential sequel of Spider-Man PS4. Plus, also adding in the mileage and travel time from how far he is from his objective is a really nice touch that I think they should have kept in this game as well. But as for something I'm glad Insomniac didn't keep within the final game is actually the earlier designs of the radio towers within New York City. And the two reasons for that being so is because A, it doesn't necessarily look like a more realistic radio tower that would be featured in Marvel's New York, but also B, is that it looks like there would be even more puzzles attached to trying and decode them. As you can see on the minimap on the right, it does showcase a bunch of other radio towers within those blue circles located throughout New York, and the one that's right in front of you in the green circle. So not only does this mean that there would be even more radio towers than what we already had to decode in the main game, but it also showcases that there would be even more of a puzzle when you were trying to solve it. Even though it might seem repetitive from the Batman Arkham games, I do like the feature where you do have to move the left and right analog sticks to find the right frequency to connect to said radio tower. So seeing that solving this one radio tower would only gain 5% coverage of the entire city shows that that might have been a bit too much added content for that one specific side objective in the earlier version. And while some people may like or dislike the radio towers in Spider-Man PS4 in general, I think that it's fine how Insomniac implemented it within the final game, and hopefully they can keep it like that in the sequel, or maybe lessen a bit instead. Now moving on to what I consider to be the most interesting aspects about the entirety of these earlier UI and HUD designs is that a lot of them do call back to a bunch of previous Spider-Man games. Specifically with this image right here, which showcases a bunch of side objectives that were completed after stopping a robbery, but the final one actually indicating a district boss battle. So not only does this sound super similar to how Insomniac games handled their open world aspects in Sunset Overdrive, but it does sound a bit similar to how it was handled in Ultimate Spider-Man. If you do manage to recall from USM, there were actually some sequences when you did do open world crimes that there would be a random mini boss that you could fight during that specific crime. And mainly when I played the game, it could have either been the ultimate version of Shocker or Boomerang. Or if you do manage to recall the combat tours from that game as well, you did have to go through an arsenal of foes until fighting the main leader at the very end. And even though I do think we had a plethora of entertaining side missions, main missions, and even primary boss fights in the final product, I wouldn't mind actually seeing this feature return in the potential sequel. This wouldn't just be a good way to expand the overall play factor of the main game itself, but it would also be a cool way to introduce some more obscure Spidey foes like what we see in City at War and the comics like Tarantula and Swarm. Now as for a main feature I'm entirely glad Insomniac updated within the release of the final game is actually the main map within the main menu of Spider-Man PS4's New York. Now even though I'm a fan of the side tab showcasing how much progress you have made within clearing the district, even though that is put in the final game as well, I do think the overall main map's visual look is kind of transparent to say the least. Now even though this may look cool from a visual perspective, I do think it's a bit hard to pinpoint exactly where each building is given the kind of blurry 3D modeling that they have on these structures. And if you do recall all the way back from GDC, they did try and slowly change their own map from how it looked here to the more normal design that we have in the final game with this render here. But if you do look really hard at the earlier design that we have of the main map here compared to the final product, you can see the inspirations that they took from this and implemented it within the final design. And if you're someone who hasn't played Spider-Man PS4 in a while, I encourage you to open the map in the game when playing it and fully zoom in on the structures that you see in the overall world. Because trust trust me, there is a lot of detail that you can find within the final design of the Marvel New York map. And if you're someone like me who's extremely nostalgic at looking back at the previous Spider-Man PS4 trailers, you will find a very awesome detail within the overall font in the main menu section. If you do pay close attention, and if you do recall the very first reveal trailer for Spider-Man PS4 all the way back at E3 2016, the font that they are using in these menus is actually the one from the very end of the trailer. And while I do appreciate the main menu tabs that we do have in the main game itself, I think this would have been a way cooler thing to add the font from the E3 2016 trailer with the hashtag Spider-Man PS4 in the final game. Because trust me, after waiting so long that we did to actually play the game, I think it would have been really nostalgic for all the hardcore Spider-Man PS4 fans like myself and all you guys to actually see some cool callback about the first trailer. And speaking of callbacks, we're now getting into the nitty-gritty of all these design showcases with specifically a bunch of influences from past Spider-Man games like Ultimate Spider-Man, Spider-Man 3 on the PS2, and Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions. And of course, I'm talking about none other than the upgrade section within Spider-Man PS4's early design. Now, even though this should stand out immediately if you're a hardcore Spider-Man fan, but the earlier design for the upgrade menu for Spider-Man PS4 looks exactly like a spider web. But if you're someone who thinks that this is completely unique and original, I wouldn't be so sure, because we did receive the exact same type of designs within the upgrade menu within Spider-Man 3 on the PS2 and even Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions. And alongside of that, it does seem to have a similar visual aesthetic to that of the Batman Arkham Knight upgrade menu, but instead of just simply being hexagons, it is actually in the form of a spider web. And again, just like the minimap itself, this does look extremely well detailed visually, but I do think it would be a bit of a complex thing to navigate around when you are trying to find a specific upgrade. For me personally, I think it was a bit of a hassle to try and navigate through the main menu within Spider-Man 3 on the PS2 to find upgrades for a specific section of Spidey's power set. And for Shattered Dimensions, it was really hard to try and track a certain challenge that you're doing, because usually most of the time you'll pretty much solve every challenge that you're given during the main level. And even though the upgrade menu is very simplistic in comparison, I do think it is easier for the player to navigate and choose specifically which upgrade they want to make their Spidey even stronger when progressing through the game. But hopefully in the sequel, there could be some way for Insomniac to blend this earlier design and the newer design to make it easier and cooler visually for everyone to enjoy. And besides that, instead of collecting resource tokens doing specific side missions in the game, it does appear that we would have instead collected specific materials and resources in the city to try and upgrade Spider-Man's gadgets. Specifically with the right side describing things like bonding agent, nylon thread, and electronic scraps. And while that does expand on the scientific mind that Peter Parker has in Spider-Man PS4's universe, I do think that they instead implemented all that within the Peter Parker gameplay at Octavius Industries, and instead made it easier for you to craft upgrades with resource tokens and experience points. Plus, that seems also similar to the extent of the Amazing Spider-Man games, where you had to collect tech gear pieces in order to craft certain upgrades for Spidey's web shooters. And because of that, I'm glad Insomniac decided not to directly copy and paste the assets that were featured in the previous Spider-Man games within Spider-Man PS4. However, given all the visual changes that Insomniac added within Spider-Man PS4's UI and HUD system in the final game, I do really wish that they actually kept these specific features in the final product instead of what we have. And of course, what I'm talking about is this awesome screen where we see a 3D model of Spider-Man's suit within upgrades that Peter can access within the menu. So as we see from this initial look, it does showcase what we have in the main game already with the gadget tab, suit tabs, and the perks tab, which ended up just being the suit mods feature in the final product. But what's even crazier than that is that Insomniac apparently had a total of 30 gadgets for Spider-Man to access in the final game. And even though the final game does come with a total of 8 gadgets, I do think 30 would have been a bit of an overkill. Now, it could just be that Insomniac decided the same thing, that does seem like a bit too much gadgets for Spidey to have, or they could be saving a whole lot more for the potential sequel. But what I love the most about this in-game suit menu compared to what we have in the final game is actually the closer look of Spidey's gadgets being upgraded when you do choose that in the tabs. For example, we do see in this specific picture Spidey trying to upgrade the electric webbing gadget within part of his suit. And instead of getting a close-up of the said gadget in the final game, we do get a close-up of the suit itself and the web shooters attached to Spider-Man's costume in general. And even though it is very cool to see a 3D render of the gadget that you are using in the game in the menu, I do think it's really high-tech of them to showcase the suit and the gadget at the same time. But what I love the most out of all of this, and one that showcases a huge tease to what lies in store for the future of this game franchise, is the suit selection section of the game in the earlier HUD version. So the first thing that stands out is that underneath Spider-Man 25, which I assume means that there's either a total of 25 suits at the time, or B, that they decided that 25 was the age of Peter Parker in in the game instead of 23. But knowing that we ended up receiving a total of 40 suits, including the entirety of the DLC as well as the free updates, which is also, fun fact, the most suits that we have received in any Spidey game ever, I do think that is more than enough Spidey costume to say the least. But what I find even more interesting is that Insomniac put their own spin on the suit descriptions that we had within Spider-Man 2000 all the way back in the PS1 days, and most recently the Amazing Spider-Man 2. And as we see on the left for the description of the advanced suit, it would appear that every suit that we would have chosen in the game would have Peter's thoughts attached to it as well. And for the advanced suit, Peter thinks, "I just want to say for the record, they haven't invented a word for how cool this armor is." So even though this is pretty much a more modernized version of the classic Spider-Man suit that we all know and love with some obvious twists invented within it, it is interesting that Peter considers this an armor instead of an actual suit. So even though we do have a Spider-Man model showcasing which suits that we pick in the final game, I do think it's more intriguing to see Spider-Man walk in place and rotate him around while we do choose our specific outfit. That was one of the biggest disappointments in my opinion, that Insomniac debunked that we would not have a 3D model showcase of characters within Spider-Man PS4 as a bonus feature, but instead just get character profiles of them in the final game. And even though we can rotate Spider-Man around in the final game, I do think it would have been cool to see him actually walking in place while we choose our Spidey outfit in this UI design. And of course, to end the video off with the final most important pieces of the earlier concepts is that we apparently get our very first look at the black suit as well as the Miles Morales costume. Now, to be granted, I don't think that these are specifically what they are going to look like in the sequel of Spider-Man PS4, but rather I do think these are what the variants would have looked like for the advanced suit in the main game. For example, if you do recall, there is obviously the vintage comic book suit within Spider-Man PS4, which if you do look closely, it's just a cel-shaded rendering of the classic Spidey costume. And specifically relating to the advanced suit itself, there are a few variants of the costume in the game already, with the negative suit as well as the anti-Ock suit. Now granted, the anti-Ock suit is its own unique Spider-Man suit design, but it does have the same exact logos as the advanced suit does, just expanded upon. And as for the negative Spider-Man suit, it's literally just the exact same as the advanced suit with a negative filter put on it. So in this case, we do see a black and white version of the advanced suit in the second spot, as well as a black and red version of the advanced suit with a different front logo in the fourth spot. Now again, Spider-Man PS4 was really early in development when they were crafting these specific suits, so maybe either A, Insomniac didn't know that they were going to tease the black suit at the end of this first game, or that they just wanted to try and have an earlier version of what the negative advanced suit would look like in the final design. Because given how the black suit was teased directly at the end of Spider-Man PS4's post-credit scene, as well as hearing what Brian Intar has said himself relating to the suit in general, I do think they are going to completely overhaul the black suit design within Spider-Man PS4's sequel. So even though this is probably just a very early concept as to what the black suit could have looked like in Spider-Man PS4, I do think that the second suit of the Miles Morales costume is once again another advanced suit variant. Now if you do look at that suit specifically, it obviously has the same red and black design that we have in the standard Miles Morales costume from the comics. But the biggest change is that they instead kept the main logo design for the advanced suit spider symbol with the legs which are extending onto the red pattern. And even more interesting is that they do still have the main outline of the main white spider symbol for the advanced suit darkened for this costume, and then have the red parts highlighted instead. Because as we see on the top of the spider symbol, there's only a total of 2 legs instead of 4. And even though it was fully shown at the end of the Silver Lining DLC that Miles is fully being trained by Peter to be Spider-Man out in the field, I do think just like with the advanced suit that Insomniac are going to fully innovate and renovate Miles' costume design for the potential sequel. And given everything that we have seen here today relating to the earlier concepts of the UI and HUD designs for Spider-Man PS4, as well as the potential looks to the black suit and the Miles Morales costume, I do think that it's safe to say that there is going to be a lot in store for the potential sequel of Spider-Man PS4. And with all that out of the way, everyone, that's the video I have for you today, and please let me know all your thoughts in the comments section down below. What did you think of this very in-depth video relating to the UI and HUD designs for Spider-Man PS4, and if anything, which part of it would you have kept or changed within the final product of the game? For me personally, I think the overall changes that Insomniac made within Spider-Man PS4's final launch game is really well rendered, and also mixing everything that we see earlier on with their own newer designs, but still I do think that they should have a similar design with the suit section in the second game what they had here. And don't worry everyone, if you're someone who still can't get off the hype train relating to Spider-Man PS4, never to fear, because Bill Roseman did confirm that the 3rd issue of Spider-Man City of War is scheduled to release on May 29th. And as we see from Bill Roseman's previous tweet here, he states, just read a lettered draft of Marvel's Spider-Man City at War number 3 on sale May 29th, and it's so fun. Last issue delivered Miles Morales' POV. This ish swings the spotlight on MJ, revealing intriguing insights into the mind of our fave rising star Daily Bugle reporter, hashtag Spider-Man PS4. And of course, as you've seen already, these are the covers that relate to the 3rd issue of City at War, which I will go over once it does release on May 29th. And until next time, everyone, thank you all so much for watching, stay spectacular, Spidey fans, and peace out.
I'd call that a mild success. I'd call that unbelievable.